Good morning, Humber Valley. My name is Trevor Brisbin, and thank you for making space for this. As this video premieres, it's Sunday, February 28th, making tomorrow the first day of March. That means Humber Valley, we got through January, we've got through February, and we did it all in COVID lockdown. Like you're doing it. This is resiliency. Celebrate today, my friends. This is a milestone worth acknowledging. On the Christian calendar, though, it's more than the end of February. It's also the season of Lent. Now, Lent is the 6 weeks leading up to Christ's death on a cross, which, like when a journey leads to the political and religious motivated execution of God, that's a journey that should be traveled carefully and reflectively. As a community, we're allowing the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament, also called the book of how. Lamentations means the book of how. And this is becoming our guide this year. And it's raw and it's deep and it asks us to do the hard work of being fully human, which sometimes, as it turns out, can leave a mark. Now, the book of Lamentations consists of 5 poems written around 500-ish years before Jesus was born. These poems were written at a time when Jerusalem was under siege and occupation by a group of people called the Babylonians, who devastated the city, kidnapping, enslaving, utterly dehumanizing the tribe of Judah. Remember, ancient Israel had 12 tribes. They decimate the tribe of Judah. They ship many of their conquered victims back to Babylon to be slaves, making them exiles. And these poems are written from the perspective of survivors, the ones who are left behind in the city. And it starts off, verse 1 starts off, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people." These are the writings of a people whose family and friends have been shipped off as slaves to a foreign land. Loved ones were killed in battle, homes and shops and entire neighborhoods burnt to the ground, livestock slaughtered. And these survivors are left in Jerusalem trying to find language and expression for the collective trauma and pain. Now, one of the more brilliant parts of these poems is the diversity of voices that are speaking. Lamentations is actually told in 3 different voices. There is a narrator who, wait for it, narrates. 8 years of theological education right there. But the narrator's job is sort of to dispassionately describe just how bad things are. Like a TV news reporter might just do like this happened and then this happened and this. So there's the narrator. Then there's the voice of a man who shows up in chapter 3. But then there's also a voice of a woman who we're going to hear from today in the second half of chapter 1. Now, the woman's voice is really interesting. Listen to what the narrator says about who this woman is. "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she." Time out. How like a widow is she? The pronoun she is referring to what noun? To the city. "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave." So there's this woman who's described as a city, as a widow, as a queen, and a slave. Do you see that? Like there's a lot going on in this woman's identity. But there's more. Verse 3. "After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations." Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. This woman is also Judah. She's a city, she's a widow, she's a queen, she's a slave, and she's the personification of the tribe of Judah. Clearly, what we're reading here is poetic. This is imagery. This is metaphor. This is not to be taken literal. Like a good poet has the ability to reach into the full scope of what language can be in order to capture what the fullness of our humanity might be. If you try to read Lamentations as anything other than poetry, it quickly becomes nonsensical. Like, how can a city be a woman? How can a woman be a tribe? How can both be queens and slaves and widows? It's like, what? Like, it doesn't work. This is one of the biggest reasons why when someone tells you they take the Bible literally, there's a degree of misguidedness happening there. The Bible doesn't work literally. It was never intended to work literally. Literarily, it works great when you recognize that poetry should be read as poetry. It expands into something far more beautiful when you use metaphor, simile, and the full imaginative capacity of language to tap into the deep parts. And sometimes only the brilliance of a poet can take us there. But I suspect you already knew that. So, there's a lot going on here in the identity of this woman. But it's interesting. She's described in very personal language, right? A widow. A widow is one who's lost that which is closest to them. They feel the pain personally, intensely, like the loss and the heartbreak doesn't get any closer or more personal than for that of a widow. But she also represents an entire tribe. She represents the city of Jerusalem. She represents a greater social, political, economic structure. She's a widow and she's a society. She's a tribe. She's Judah. Lament is about the personal struggles, disappointments, and heartbreak we feel in the most intimate and personal of ways. And lament is about the systemic and inherent struggles, disappointments, and damage embedded within the structures that govern societies. Do you see that? To lament is to recognize and express the personal pain and damage we carry within our beings. But it's also to give voice and expression to the larger systemic wounds and damage carried by a society. Are you with me? Because now we're getting ready to do some preaching. Now, the book of Lamentations is a book about exile. Verse 3, after affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells amongst the nations. She finds no rest there. Exile. This is a book about a displaced people. This is a book about people who have lost their home and wonder if they'll ever get it back. And Lamentations comes at exile in two ways. There are those who have been physically taken from their home in Jerusalem and forced into Babylon. This is what you might call a physical exile. But the poems are spoken not by those who have been taken from their home, but by those who are still in the city. They haven't lost their physical home per se, but amidst the rubble and the ruins, they've lost what you might call their heart home. Do you know what I mean by that? Sometimes exile isn't a physical thing. Sometimes we lose our bearings or our belongingness in an emotional or a spiritual or a soul kind of way. Has something ever been yours, but somewhere along the line, either you change or the thing changes, And for you, it's no longer what it once was. It's no secret that I was ordained Baptist. I served as a Baptist minister for 15 years. One of the things that happened in that time as I grew and as my experience of Christ deepened, I began to feel less and less at home in a tradition that not only held but valued the exclusion of gay people and the coercive doctrines like hell. And as my faith deepened, I didn't want to be that. I didn't see that as reflective of what Christianity was meant to be. Like, there was a time in my early 20s and early 30s where I built my identity and my spiritual home and my tribe around conservative evangelical ideology. I own that. But along the way, it got to the point where I had to come to the painful, even crisis-inducing realization that I no longer had a home in that tradition. As I began to think more inclusively and reconsider the big questions about God, it wasn't just my theology that changed, it was that everything changed because of my theology. There's an exile that happens when the thing that was your thing, the people that were your people, the place that was your place, is no longer that for you. You hear people talk about marriage sometimes, where the kids grow up and move out of the house, and one morning you look across the pillow and you wonder who that person is lying beside you. Of course, you know it's your spouse because you've been married to them for like 30 years, but maybe somewhere, somehow along the line, your paths, your dreams, your desires have diverged, and you begin to realize that they've become more like a stranger than a lover. That's exile. It's that feeling where you can't go out to eat at your favorite restaurant. You can't get together with your parents or your adult kids. You can't meet your friends for a dinner party. It's when your city is in lockdown. Yeah, it's your city, but the spirit has fundamentally changed. The soul is gone. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's your city, but it's not your city like it once was. Oh, we know exile. It's after the death of a parent or a spouse or a child, and you begin to wonder, where do I even belong in this world? The world is still here, but it feels like the soul has been ripped from it. That's exile. And Lamentations, or to lament, says, yeah, life can feel that hard. This is what this little book does for us. This is why this obscure book in the middle of the Hebrew Bible is so important and revolutionary and God-inspired. Lamentations teaches us how to give voice to what's amiss in our world, in our person. It names where disappointment lives. It refuses to deny or repress human sadness. It exposes it. To lament is to open ourselves up to talk about where the grief and the anger are. To lament is to wear the t-shirt that says if you repress it, you can't address it. And in a world that is so good at denying pain and minimizing the places that are broken, to lament is to name them, expose them, and say, this needs space to be talked about. Are you carrying exile in a way that maybe it's time to start talking about? So remember the three voices Lamentations is told by the narrator, a man and a woman. The first 11 and a half verses of chapter 1 are told by the narrator. But at the end of verse 11, the narrator is interrupted by the woman who speaks for the first time. And she calls out in this desperate prayer, "Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised." That's it. That's her prayer. She wants God to see her pain and her anguish. She wants God to know what she's going through. God, are you even paying attention to this? Then after calling out to God, the woman then begins crying out to anyone who might listen. She pleads in verse 12, "Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look around and see." So at first she's like, "God, look at me." Then she hears nothing back from God, so she's like, "People passing by, like you, like, hello, can you see me? Do you see what I'm going through? Does anyone see what this mess is? Does anyone know what this feels like?" And then she goes on in verse 18. Listen to what she says. She says, "Listen, all you people." She's still talking to those passerbyers. "Listen, all you people. Look on my suffering." Verse 19. "I called out to all my allies." Like, do even my friends hear? Verse 20. "See, Lord, I'm in distress." Like, Lord, are you seeing this? And verse 21. "People have heard my groaning." Like, I keep talking. Do you see? Do you hear? Can you please look? Now back to verse 12, just quickly. She says, "Is any suffering?" Look around and see, "Is any suffering like my suffering?" Look and see, "Is any suffering like my suffering?" Friends, there is no suffering like when you feel you're suffering alone and no one sees it. May we be the people who see each other's suffering. May we be the people who see the suffering of others. And this takes us back to the woman. Earlier we talked about how she was described in a personal way like a widow. But she's also described to be Jerusalem, to be the tribe. She's the larger social and political dynamic at work in the world. So here it is. There are people who live in our city and our country who are part of our society for whom daily life is always an experience of exile. There are people who, because of the color of their skin, because of their economic status, because of the God they pray to, experience everyday exile in our city. We live in Toronto, where according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, if you are black, you are 20 times more likely to be killed by police than if you're white. 20 times. We live in a city where 8.8% of our population is black, but account for 61% of cases in which police used force that led to death, and 70% of all cases where police shootings resulted in death. And the woman cries out, "Look around and see. Does anyone passing by see my suffering?" Exile. You ever hear of Nuscantega? I hadn't heard of it before this week. It's an indigenous reserve in the far north of Ontario where they've been under a boil water advisory for 25 years. Since 1995. How old were you in 1995? What do you think would happen if Central Etobicoke was under a boil water advisory for like 25 hours? 25 years. And they're calling out, like, does anyone even see us up here? Do you see what's going on? Exile. According to Statistics Canada, hate crimes against Muslim Canadians grew 253% between 2012 and 2015. According to a 2017 poll, 74% of Canadians are in favor of a Canadian values test for Muslim immigrants, while 23%, almost a quarter of all Canadians, support a complete ban on Muslim immigration altogether. That goes up to 32% in Quebec. There is damage being done in the systems and structures of our society. Muslims living in exile. According to the Chinese Canadian National Council, more than 600 incidences of anti-East Asian racism have been reported since the emergence of COVID-19. One poll of more than 500 people of Chinese ethnicity across Canada found that 50% of respondents said that they have been called names or insulted as a direct result of COVID. 61% said they've adjusted their routines in order to avoid unpleasant encounters. Look, listen, does anyone see? This is exile. You ever pull up to a stoplight and beside you is a car like with super dark tinted windows and you can feel the entire ground shaking because of the bass and the music is so loud and the hip hop beats roar like every other word seems to be an expletive. You ever been beside that car? You have, right? What's your first instinct? Your first response? Do you get annoyed? Maybe a bit judgy? Maybe a certain level of like disdain for that car? What do you do? What do you do? If you are 20 times more likely to get shot by the police simply because you're black, what do you do? If your people have been left with poisonous water to drink for 25 years, what do you do? If you feel like the majority of your neighbors don't want you living here because you call God Allah, what do? You turn up the volume. You lament. You go out of your way to get loud, to say to passerbys, please hear this. Like somebody hear me, see me. Do you see what's going on? Look at this. Do you know what this feels like? And if I have to swear, if the bass needs to boom before someone will pay attention, so be it, because please see that I am living in exile. To lament is to name, to expose, to bring to light what's broken and not working, that something might be done about it. Because you can't address it if you repress it. So friends, in this Lenten journey, we're invited to lament, to feel the full depth of our humanity, to be honest about where there's sadness and disappointment and loss. And we're implored to lament, to see, to hear, to expose, and to act in those spaces where the social and political and economic structures of our society have turned against the beauty of humanity. Exile. Do you see it? Into the spaces of exile, may we be the gospel. May we become the good news. May we be the body of Christ. May we be the light of Jesus.